Salman Abedi, the man responsible for the 2017 Manchester bombing attack, could and should have been identified as a threat on the night of his attack, which killed 22 people and injured hundreds of others. The public inquiry into the attack has said unacceptable and unjustified failures had been identified and that police and security should have done more. He describes the most striking opportunity as being when a member of public raised concerns about Abedi to a security guard but felt fobbed off. Another security guard told the inquiry he had what he calls bad feeling about Salman Abedi, but he didn't want to approach him for fear of being branded a racist. A number of recommendations have been made in the report, but first, let's hear some statements from the families of the victims.
Every life taken in this horrendous attack has destroyed the lives of those close to them, and like the many other families affected, we don't want anyone else to go through what we have following the loss of Philip. It has been extremely hard to listen to evidence which has highlighted how our government has failed to take extra steps to ensure security, as it should be at venues.
Now, Sir John Saunders, the chairman of the Manchester Arena Public Inquiry, has said that there were shortcomings, serious shortcomings, in fact, by all security, or lots of the security at Manchester Arena. Now, I'm joined by security expert Will Geddes and GB News' Tom Harwood. Tom, if I can start with you, please, just explain to our viewers a little bit more about this inquiry today.
Well, today we've seen the release of the first report out of 3 that make up this inquiry. This report is into the security around the event and around what happened. We've got some more coming in about that will take a longer time to pop up, about the emergency response and so on. But this today was focusing on security, and it found some really large holes in what should have been done. Not only were there people who reported a suspicious-looking man with a large bag to security guards there. Security guards there weren't particularly trained, and there were no British Transport Police officers there when they were supposed to be. There was also a large CCTV blind spot in the concourse where Mr. Abedi was hiding out, or rather standing, for an hour before he detonated that bomb. Some really serious failings found. And no doubt some very serious consequences.
Indeed. Well, before I come to you, we have a clip here of Sir John Saunders, who is, I mentioned, the chairman of the public inquiry. So let's just take a look at what he had to say today.
Having considered the totality of that evidence and the submissions which have been made to me, both orally and in writing, by all those involved in this part of the inquiry, I have concluded that there were serious shortcomings in the security provided by those organisations which had responsibility for it, and also failings and mistakes by some individuals.
Now, let's be clear, there's obviously the ultimate blame for this atrocity, devastating atrocity, has to lay, of course, with the bomber himself. And there's a lot of focus tonight, Will, on security and what could and should have been done better. You yourself are a security expert. Tom has just mentioned there in the report, we're talking about CCTV black spots, inadequate patrols, etc. Is it possible for security to have stopped something like this?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, and to be honest, there are many different moving parts when you're protecting a large-scale venue like this. You know, Manchester Arena is a huge venue, and you're going to have lots of different elements of security. So you've got the stadium zone security, you've got stewards, you've got the police. And one of the things that I kind of determined from the findings of this report, and certainly from what Sir John actually came out with today, was that there was a big break in communications in terms of how the police and the security were working together. And there were not clear guidelines, especially for the security, the stewards, in what they should do in certain situations when they identify something suspicious. But the thing that really worried me the most was the fact that general members of the public reporting to a security officer, or to a police officer for that matter, something that they deem suspicious, not being followed up on.
Yeah, and I think what we have to say is, if you think back to 2017, it was you know, the atmosphere then, we had a severe threat level. There had been other attacks that had taken place in different countries, you know, in musical venues. So people were on high alert. As members of the public, we had been told, if you see something that you think is suspicious, you know, don't just ignore it. And a member of the public did actually go up to the man we now know to be the bomber and say, you know, what you're doing kind of thing. He then went to one security guard who mentioned it to another security guard, and there was failings in radio communications apparently there. But then also there was a second sense, the chap mentioned in the inquiry today, that he felt a bad feeling, was his exact quote, but he didn't want to falsely accuse somebody for fear of being a racist. And I mean, I've never worked in security, Will, and I imagine that you do have to make, you know, sometimes quite split-second decisions. Like, you know, how easy is it to be told something and follow up on that? What's it like? Well,
to be honest, I mean, sometimes you do have to make those difficult calls, and you have to do those particular sort of selections or profiling or approaches to individuals that could be deemed as you being unfair or unjust. But your role fundamentally as security is to make sure that everybody in that venue is safe or in that location is safe. I mean, I remember when I was running security operations during the 2012 Olympics, and I was at most of the major events down in Stratford, and I'd have members of the general public come up to me, and even though I was working in a private capacity, they'd say, oh, we saw someone, do you want to investigate it? And I would speak to the stadium staff and say, guys, just a heads up, have a look at this person, or I've just been notified of this. It's following up on those little increments of intelligence, but there's also other aspects which concerned me, which was the part of the attack cycle is the pre-attack reconnaissance. And there were two separate occasions, and actually on the day itself, by Salman Abedi, that weren't picked up. And hostile surveillance or hostile reconnaissance detection is absolutely key. And you've got to pick up on these kind of activities, or someone appearing, as Tom was saying, in a location that they shouldn't be.
But let me ask you about that, because I've heard this criticism today myself, and that came out in the report that this person had done, you know, gone and done what I would call a recce. That's not my scientific term, so forgive me. But, you know, he's gone and multiple times this site. But why would anyone be looking to piece together, oh, there's a person at this venue, and then the next day, probably a separate security person on shift or whatever the next day? Why would it be natural to connect somebody? Just in everyday circumstances, you see someone attending a venue, why would you connect those dots? Absolutely, you've got to connect those dots. I mean, I've worked with some stadia in terms of determining and putting that picture together, that jigsaw puzzle of reconnaissance in advance. And usually when someone does carry out this kind of reconnaissance, they can often flag out to security who are trained to identify those kinds of patterns of behaviour to say, this is someone who's perhaps a bit more suspicious. You record that information. Most of these stadia have really good CCTV, so there's no reason why they can't record individuals and say to the next shift or whoever is on next duty to say, we've seen this individual, just keep your eyes open for them. And that's really important, because it's rare that a terrorist attack will be so spontaneous that there hasn't been some planning or some recce's, as you say, in advance of it taking place. And Tom, what happens now then? You mentioned this is just the first report. What's the next steps?
Well, there are two more reports to come. The consequences of this report aren't to be sniffed at, though. There have been some policy recommendations, some guidance recommendations, some things to explore. For example, people who observe CCTV being licensed and being much more up on what they should be looking out for. There's also a proposal in there that's more controversial about putting on a legal obligation of venues to prepare for this kind of stuff, or be much more aware of disaster planning with regard to terrorism. Now, the Home Secretary has made in a statement today, she said that she will look very carefully at the recommendations of this report. That doesn't mean that they'll all be implemented, and I'm sure they will be scrutinised in great detail, but that could well be the legislative consequence of what has been found today. Yeah, and I mean, the heartbreak that these families must go through, because when you lose a loved one, especially in unexpected, tragic circumstances, you know, you do, a part of that grieving process is you want to blame, you want to understand, you want to apportion blame. And then to find out, as some of these families have done today, that perhaps, and I do emphasise the word perhaps, it could have been certainly limited. It must be
devastating, because there's no way of knowing that if that security specialist had radioed through and made contact and then they'd intercepted this person, nobody knows what would happen. So it's just a big bunch of what ifs, isn't it? But, you know, he was there, he was spotted, and I've seen the CCTV today, and he was walking past those officers multiple times, wasn't he?
What Sir John said in his report, though, was while he didn't hold back from blaming some individuals and some organisations, he also made note that some of those individuals who did receive some quite heavy blame in the report were the first to run into the incidents once it happened. They were some of the bravest people first responding to it. So this isn't a black and white situation. There are some institutional failures here, some personal failures here, but also some moments of real bravery and humanity.
And I think the most important product of these kind of inquiries, and certainly these kind of reviews, has to be lessons learned. And the one thing that happens, I mean, 2017 was an unprecedented year. And as you say, there were a number of terrorist attacks. There were 5 significant attacks in the UK, the first of which was Westminster. And it's a lessons learned exercise. And every time a terrorist attack takes place, agencies from around the world, and this is the United States and everywhere, will come over, review what happened so that they don't make the same mistakes themselves. And it is, to a certain degree, easy to look at these things with hindsight and say, this could have happened, this should have happened. Now, that's not to say there weren't serious failings in that whole management of the security and how actually it was dealt in terms of how those officers responded. But it's got to be a lessons learned. It's got to be coming away from this and making us ultimately more secure in the future.
Yeah, and we talk about the future, but taking it back to the time, the security setup in terms of staffing levels, etc., wasn't they following the guidelines? That's just how it was expected to be at that time and was deemed adequate at that time.
Well, you assess the threat according to what you know, and certainly because the police were involved, you know, the BTP were involved in terms of them attaching officers, obviously, to the event. There are situations where you have to risk assess it. You have to deem what the risk potentially could be. Now, I don't think...
And presumably that would have happened, a risk assessment would have happened before a concert on this scale.
Absolutely, absolutely. But also we were at a heightened level of terrorism. And this is something where, to be honest, every single officer has to be focused on in terms of, do they understand what their engagements are, what they need to do, what their procedures are, what their protocols are. Inevitably, with a big event, you will have those that will fall between the gaps, and they will fail. However, it's the responsibility of the organisation to ensure that everybody knows what they should be doing. But there were so many different elements in play, from lack of communications, blind spots of CCTV, blind spots for communications. These kind of situations had to have contingencies for in what to do if those things happen.
And in terms of time frame, Tom, when do we expect this report's investigation to be concluded?
Well, one of the tragic things for this family, of course, is that this happened 4.5 years ago. We're talking about May 2017. Such a long time ago, and it's taken until now for just these first recommendations to come out. Now, as I say, there are 2 more reports to come that will take months more, but at least there is something for those families today. Some concrete findings, some apportionment of blame, some ability to move on. Yeah, and I mean, I wonder how the families must be feeling tonight, because it must just be awful. Nothing will bring those victims back, and nothing will return life back to normal for those people that lived through that event. So, of course, our thoughts are with you, and we will keep you updated as the inquiry progresses. But for now, Tom and Will, thank you very much for your time.